Whenever I become disappointed with playing multiplayer games, whether it be Call of Duty, Overwatch, among other titles, I like to take a step back from gaming and appreciate what makes it genuinely entertaining. When I get a larger scope of the industry, I always see my shiny blue and red Nintendo Switch sitting on my desk, right next to my PC. I see my 3DS on the shelf behind me. I see my Wii and my GameCube packed into a cardboard box in my living room. I'm reminded of all the great times I had enjoying myself on Nintendo's creative and innovative titles, whether they were single player, split screen, or multiplayer. It helps me remember that I should appreciate Nintendo games now more than ever, because despite the current climate of the gaming industry, Nintendo is pushing out more and more quality games. Now don't get me wrong, Nintendo does have its fair share of controversy, greed, and scandals. For one great example, in a money-hungry fit, Nintendo was copywriting any gameplay using Luigi's Mansion Dark Moon in 2013, where other companies would normally see a Let's Play as free advertising where both parties, the player and the company, reap the benefits. However, Nintendo was determined to make all of the revenue from the Let's Play videos of this game. When they finally revoked this policy, it wasn't long until they were asking for a quarter of the revenue from every video showcasing their newest games. It was truly a ridiculous and outrageously greedy thing for them to do. Another fantastic example is genuinely just hating any kind of external fan projects or competitions that involve their creative work. Players will sometimes spend the better part of a decade making a mod or fan project that involves one of their games for absolutely zero profit, only for them to somehow see it as competition and work their hardest to shut down anything and everything that use their games, engines, and code, despite it not making a single penny. Additionally, their notorious hatred of competitive communities surrounding Super Smash Bros. Is also very well known everywhere. In contrast to companies like Epic Games, Riot Games, and Blizzard, who invest millions of dollars into the competitive scene and in turn generate more revenue and attention for the game, Nintendo completely shuns and disavows all competitive Smash and is clearly not into the idea. Long story short, their game is their game, and you should play their game and not do anything extra with it, even if it's extremely entertaining, fun, or magnificent. That being said, despite Nintendo's horrible connection with people who are truly passionate about the games they release, they have withstood the test of time and have what I believe to be the best design philosophy of any modern gaming enterprise. Nintendo publishes high-quality games virtually every single year without fail, something that Western companies can only dream of doing at this point. Let's dive in and take a look at why, aside from being pretty ruthless when it comes to tournaments and spin-offs, why Nintendo has withstood the test of time and continues to push out quality, innovative games. The limits for gaming have really been stretched so unbelievably far out at this point in time. It's now more clear than ever what works and what doesn't. The different genres of the gaming world have been absolutely defined, whether you like shooters, strategy games, platformers, hack and slashers, horror games, puzzles, or games that Souls-like, or indie games, and the hundreds of other genres. Now it's very much about taking these genres and expanding upon them, and pushing the boundaries of what makes games great and improving them even more. That being said, with games having been around for about 52 years, serious and unbelievable advances have been made, as we all can see. It gives us plenty of things to look back on to see what worked, what flopped, and what milestones were hit in regards to what the super large gaming audience liked in regards to their experience playing games. What this retrospect also gives us is this feeling of nostalgia, the appreciation of a game because it reminds us of our distant past, when times might have been easier in our lives. We often gaze on these time periods with rose-tinted lenses, for lack of a better term. Nonetheless, companies pushed forward and over time created legendary titles that, even at near 15 to 20 years old, still outperform most next-gen games we're seeing being released in the 2010s and 2020s. As a couple examples of extremely creative and definitive games over the years, in no particular order, we can look at Ocarina of Time, which is sometimes looked at as the greatest video game ever created, Super Mario Galaxy, Call of Duty Black Ops 2, Minecraft, Portal, Age of Empires 2, Halo Reach, Overwatch, Bloodborne, Red Dead Redemption, Dark Souls, and the recent Elden Ring, Fortnite, World of Warcraft, BioShock, Final Fantasy, among many others that I didn't name. All of these games revolutionized the gaming scene and showed the audience the true pinnacle of what they could receive from a gaming experience, and as such, their sequels, or updates from more modern titles, attempted to expand upon what its predecessor did first and did the best, some successfully, some not so successfully. As franchises carry forward, games obviously improve in graphical quality and the amount of content that is available in every title. However, somewhere along the line, when gaming got extremely advanced, with the release of the Nintendo Switch, Xbox One, and PS4, something changed. Games no longer were about the entertainment value or revolutionizing the industry for all to see. Rather, it was about the money that could be garnered by doing two pretty disingenuous things. Firstly, by abusing the name of a franchise that would purely make sales based on the name of the game, the main culprit being Call of Duty, that has released half-finished games with lackluster content and janky gameplay that changes the core feeling of COD. And secondly, conceptualizing extremely ambitious projects that ultimately fail and backfire and releases a buggy, incomplete mess, more akin to an alpha build than a full game, because of the release deadlines. Funny enough, we see Xbox and PlayStation releases do this all the time. But as far as I'm concerned, Nintendo still puts out masterpieces to this day. Super Mario Odyssey and The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild were releasing when Modern Warfare 2019 and Cyberpunk were soon to follow just a couple years later, and Tears of the Kingdom released after the enormous failure of Modern Warfare 2 and just before the divisive release of Starfield, proving that Nintendo is one of, if not the most consistent game company we've ever seen. Sure, they might not be that classy when it comes to the community, but they sure do know how to make a good game. What separates Nintendo from the bunch is that they can take what makes a past title great and release a successor that isn't only better than its predecessor, it also adds new and fun mechanics that can subsequently be used in the following release. Take the Super Mario Bros. Series, a game that's been around for 40 years. It's the same platforming fun, with increasingly better graphics and new systems that improve the quality of life and of the game. And then when Mario decided to go 3D for the first time in Super Mario 64, Nintendo stayed true to many aspects of the game and created new and fun three-dimensional challenges for the player to engross themselves with. Long story short, for a franchise that's been around for 40 years, the same platforming fun never gets old because each game is innovation done right. And if you thought Super Mario 64 was good, wait until the release of Super Mario Sunshine, and then Super Mario Galaxy, which was astoundingly innovative and a groundbreaking title, then the sequel, Super Mario Galaxy 2, which in my opinion was even better, and then several years later, Super Mario Odyssey, which is undoubtedly a top 3 Mario game, taking every dimension of Mario and culminating it into a super fun, exciting, and rich Mario experience that was absolutely amazing and highly critically acclaimed. The point is, Nintendo takes their beloved franchises and saturates what makes it great every passing year. Nintendo doesn't try to experiment with different features that affect the core gameplay of the game, and when they do, it's an entirely different spin-off of the game. That's why Super Mario Bros. And Super Mario 64 are different titles, and Mario 64 was not Super Mario Bros. 4. It wouldn't make sense. It's not a side-scroller. It's a 64-bit 3D platformer with its own unique gameplay. And if this seems like a weak point, consider this. Every game with the term Mario Bros. In it has never not been a side-scroller. Every time you see Mario Bros., you know that it's a side-scrolling Mario game and not a 3D platformer Mario game. Every single one is like this. Nintendo took the flavor of their 8-bit side-scroller and were eventually able to use technological advances to make a 3D Mario game. But that didn't necessarily appease the fans of side-scroller Mario, so they correctly made the decision to have both 3D Mario platformers and side-scroller Mario platformers being separate, instead of surprising fans that want a side-scroller with a 3D game that totally won't please their need for a side-scrolling game. However, to get back on track, saturating what makes a game good and breaking it off into other series and attributing a different name to a game that changes the flavor of the game too much is exactly what keeps Nintendo in such good standing with their community, and it keeps quality titles constantly flowing out every single year. Let's focus on my original point. Nintendo takes their successful games and saturates what makes them good. It doesn't try to spin off the titles and alter mechanics that change the flavor of what made the last title and the series great. Every time you see Super Mario Bros., you know you're going to be playing a side-scroller with the same controls, same mechanics, and if there are new mechanics, they're never game-breaking and they're only ever additive. They never take away positives from previous titles. For example, the Fire Flower wasn't removed from any Mario game ever, except for Super Mario Sunshine, which had barely any power-ups at all, because why would you do that? Nintendo made the Ice Flower for Super Mario Bros. Wii, but it didn't replace the Fire Flower from all the other games for the sake of quote-unquote innovation. That would just have left players questioning what on earth was going on. Although a more rough example, additive innovation is much better than subtractive, because you don't run the risk of turning people off with taking away things that they loved in the previous installments. Another wonderful thing that modern developers could take note from Nintendo is the fact that they were making games chock full of content functional on release, with barely any bugs, quickly and effectively. For a great example, take The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time, which contends to be the greatest video game ever made, and if you haven't played it, play it. It's incredible. But anyways, that game is very long, scrutinizingly crafted, has a wonderful soundtrack, insanely well designed and fun puzzles, intuitive and smooth combat, a great interface for the time period, and a really good one for the 3DS remaster, a super large open world with so many side quests and other things to explore, and a captivating and deep story that surpasses many modern-day single-player game storylines. And this game was developed in 2.5 years for the first generation of consoles that supported 3-dimensional and 64-bit graphics. It was the first 3D Zelda game, and it's easily and indisputably the best, despite every other 3D Zelda game also darn close to consistently being 10 out of 10 games. Nintendo had a vision for their game, and executed exactly that. They didn't overdo anything or overfill it with too many things to do. Sure, there was a grind to find certain things like rupees and heart pieces, But that was more or less the grindy aspect of the game. There were no ridiculous or repetitive activities, and most of it just ended up in you immersing yourself even more in the game as a result of doing some digging. They also fulfilled their goal for the storyline, designed the dungeons, made sure the game was basically bug-free, or at least in a state where the game couldn't be broken by such bugs, and from there, released their creative vision to be played by all. The lesson to take away from this masterpiece of a game is that you don't have to make your game literally like Life 2. It doesn't have to be riddled with a crazy, tedious grind, an enormous, ambitious world with thousands of side quests, or anything of the like. If you can pull it off like Elden Ring did, then more power to you. But the problem is that games like Starfield and Cyberpunk were losing their identities trying to make the game so unbelievably large and intricate, where just having good mechanics and a well-written story would have sufficed. Even if that was super difficult, at least it would give them time to drop a DLC and a patch to remediate any bugs found within the game. But it just seems like these games were released rushed and barely even bug tested at all, and there's a reason for that. And I use Cyberpunk and Starfield, but there are other games this applies to for sure. And the reason is that games are extremely ambitious, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but they're overshooting the goal and trying to cram everything into the game before the release deadline and before the hype surrounding the game dies. And in doing such, are overlooking the most basic part of the game, which are the core mechanics, the quality of the story, if the game is single player of course. There are multiplayer games notoriously releasing unfinished like the new COD titles, and the cleanups of any game-breaking bugs and disturbing graphical mishaps that ruin the immersion factor. These companies that design these super ambitious games are shooting for the stars, but creating a rocket that doesn't even escape the atmosphere because its parts are far too rushed and underdeveloped and have too much flair and overcomplications that the core features of the rocket don't function properly because they weren't giving the attention that they deserved before launch. It's not like Ocarina of Time was very technologically advanced. Well, for the time it was, but compared to now, the graphics and the amount of accessible items are pretty laughable. But the game still smashed and exceeded all expectations and was an 11 out of 10 title. And how did it do that? I mean, there's only 3 weapons, 3 shields, only 22 items, which are all pretty easily acquired. It has a linear story, but some side quests if your curiosity gets the best of you, and only 12 dungeons, which are pretty substantially sized and long. And of course, challenges and storytelling in between those dungeons as well. The dungeons vary in difficulty, and each have a boss fight and grant you an improvement to your overall character as a whole, and completing quests will yield higher quality gear, although a very limited number, like boots and gauntlets, which are included in the 22 item count to help you along in your endeavors. The game is extremely straightforward, not complicated, excluding the challenging puzzles of course, doesn't have a lot in the way of items to collect, limited combat options and movement abilities, and it certainly doesn't have revolutionary graphics. Why does it still hold up today? And why was it so darn impressive? Well, the game has an identity. It knows what it is. Nothing feels restrictive or suffocating or boring because it does what it's intended and supposed to do, and it does it really damn well. Everything Nintendo had, they poured it into the core of the game, which was the story and the dungeons. Everything else was clearly secondary, and they also had limited resources as a result of obvious technological limitations. But ultimately, it came down to sticking with what was going to make the game as fun as possible. They didn't make an overcomplicated weapon or shield system, nor did they make it any more complex to upgrade your gauntlets and get different boots. And how could they with the technology? They had to really simplify it, and it ended up working extremely well in their favor. Did the player do this one task or complete this one dungeon or quest? Alright, great, better sword, better gauntlets. Is the player coming up on a dungeon that has never before seen mechanics that add a fun twist to it? Awesome, okay. Here's a grappling hook, some hover boots, steel boots, the lens of truth, the Goron bracelet, the mirror shield. Everything in the game served the purpose of the game, which was the experience of playing through the story. New items were only a reward because without them, you couldn't brave the next task at hand. This being said, maybe Starfield and Cyberpunk were trying to focus on these things, but were rushed to a deadline. Or maybe they just tried to do too much, and as a result, were sacrificing the development of solid gameplay, maintaining a decent frame rate, or having low amounts of graphical mishaps. With how unbelievably large and intricate new titles are, it's easy to believe that the developers are not focusing on the first things first, which is, what is our game's identity and how do we best fulfill that? Nintendo does this very, very consistently. With their most viable franchises, they've never really missed. Sure, some titles are worse than others, but ultimately their games have so much entertainment value because they do exactly what they're intended to do, and they do them really, really well. Even the sequel to Ocarina of Time, Majora's Mask, task is regarded as a 10 out of 10 game with a fantastic story, arguably even better than Ocarina's, great dungeons that are reminiscent of what its prequel did so well, and new mechanics that only ever built upon what was happening previously, never destroyed it. The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild played upon the open world concept with fantastic success. Why? Although it's an enormous game with a ton of side quests, tons of puzzles, and it even changes the original flavor of Zelda from a linear story with dungeons to a free open world game, it still doesn't lose its identity. It merely builds upon what makes Zelda great. Shrines are a really large and widespread substitute for the puzzle lovers. The open world is great for the explorers, the side quests are great for the completionists, and the divine beasts add that extra puzzle element that is reminiscent of being a dungeon in older games, even if it doesn't necessarily feel as large. Build additively upon what makes your franchise good. Don't subtract, even if the flavor and feel is somewhat new. Since Zelda is a single-player game, it's surely a fantastic example of this philosophy that Nintendo evidently practices when making a sequel, focusing on a game's strengths and saturating them when developing a sequel, and also making sure to focus on what makes a game that game is a fantastic way to keep producing consistently good titles. Even if they do have reminiscent flavors of their predecessors, there's always something new, and more importantly, that new thing is an additive improvement, not a subtractive downgrade. This philosophy is more than applicable when it comes to multiplayer titles as well. Because of that, let's take a brief look at the most popular multiplayer game ever created, Fortnite. Fortnite used the same philosophy as Zelda, no matter how outrageous that sounds. Focus on what makes the game unique, and focus all of your development first on serving the purpose of the game. What exactly is Fortnite? Well, it's a 100-player third-person battle royale shooter in which you can build. Alright, fantastic. How can Epic Games best focus on that to make it the most fun possible, and not a mess with over-expanding the title yet? And there's a big emphasis on yet, because they did expand, but they waited until the core game took off. They focused on the core mechanics of the game and what gave the game its identity. And what do you know? We get the most popular multiplayer game ever created. Think about it this way. What does a third-person, cartoon-style battle royale game in which you can build need to function at the most bare bones level? Well, definitely a very smooth and functional camera, movement that isn't too slow so it can accommodate the fact that you can build, weapons of different classes like ARs and SMGs and so forth, but not too complex of a system because that's not the focus of the game, and a giant map with different POIs to make landing interesting and keep gameplay fresh. This is exactly what was focused on. Consider the first release of Fortnite Battle Royale when it was in Season 0, 1, and 2. The game, especially in Season 0, was extremely bare bones. It had a giant map with named locations, 2 of each different kind of weapon class with non-specific and ambiguous names like assault rifle and burst assault rifle, and a smooth, functional camera and building system that gave the game its initial intrigue and uniqueness. Pair that with a likable cartoon style of art and 100-player matches, and you get exactly what Fortnite is, a 100-player third-person battle royale shooter in which you can build. And even in its most bare-bones state, players still absolutely ate it up, because even in its most simple iteration, Fortnite had its identity, and then after they built up a following is when they came up with the battle pass and seasons and different modes and creative modes and everything else we have now, like different creator collaborations and new skins and starter packs and everything else they'll sell cosmetically for money, and a huge competitive scene with different prize pools and huge tournaments and tournaments that anyone can enter. Hundreds upon hundreds of new and wacky guns and items to keep the game fresh and spice up the meta. Point being, once Fortnite established what it was and kept moving forward, that's when players started appreciating the updates and the variety that it gave the game. Also, consider how Fortnite's updates affected the skill ceiling. Epic never said, oh, players are becoming too good at building, let's nerf building. No, they never limited it. Epic Games made it a point to make building the central focus of the game because that's what the game is about. And they made sure that every update to building was only going to further its development and make it faster and smoother. And that's what they did. Turbo building, auto-confirming edits, different controller sensitivities for building and editing. By enhancing and further saturating the elements that gave the game its identity, the more Fortnite was able to grow into a huge global phenomenon. If we take a multiplayer game getting a lot of backlash like Call of Duty, they're doing the exact opposite. It's almost like a paradox. They're focusing too much on battle passes, bundles, cosmetics, and trivial things instead of actually worrying about saturating and improving upon the innovations that Call of Duty has built over the years. Furthermore, instead of trying to saturate the COD formula and make it better, the developers are trying to initiate a different vision into a franchise franchise where the vision never failed before. For example, the jetpack era of COD, which spanned from Advanced Warfare to Black Ops 3 to Infinite Warfare, which everybody hated, or the tactical era of COD, starting with Modern Warfare 2019, then moving to Vanguard, then moving to Modern Warfare 2 in its worst form. All of these new titles tried to reinvent the game's identity and abuse the name of the game to make sales while experimenting with a new flavor of the game. Problem is, players clearly don't take well to these changes. In trying to reinvent the flow of the game, the original feel of COD is lost, along with its identity. And not all the reinventions were bad either. Companies can usually always find subtle ways to improve things, even if the title is overall pretty bad. For example, even though Modern Warfare 2019 was a terrible game with a terrible meta, it did have the best movement and gunplay Call of Duty has ever seen to this day, and they rightfully stuck with that movement and gunplay for the future releases. Alright, so that's one innovation that they got right, despite the game being horrible. However, when Modern Warfare 2 released, they decided to subtractively downgrade this change and slow down the movement that was so well liked in its prequel. Taking away something well liked for the sake of changing up the feel of the game dramatically to take a fast-paced shooter like COD and make it slower and more tactical is the #1 way to lose players and fans, and that's ultimately demonstrated in the retention numbers. The only reason the sales broke records was because the game was egregiously and unfairly overhyped, which only resulted in the biggest letdown in COD's history. The bigger they are, the harder they fall. As a result of this focus on money-making strategies and trying to reinvent the game's identity in order to cater to casuals and keep things quote-unquote fresh, their game has very lackluster content on launch, including a sad amount of maps that highly lack in quality and gameplay that just isn't the right pace of play to feel like Call of Duty. Imagine they had stuck to keeping COD's identity intact and not destroy it for the sake of money and quote-unquote originality, focusing on smooth and satisfying gunplay, keeping the fantastic movement they developed, and using the same map design philosophies from maps they knew the player base loved back in the older games would be a great way to start. Sure, the cosmetics are super cool, and they're certainly expensive, but that's not the part of the game that needs to be good first, and that's not the reason why people play the game. Fortnite demonstrated that before you go crazy with cosmetics, you need to establish your game's identity. What is it at its core? For Modern Warfare 2, you can't really tell, and you certainly can't tell it's a Call of Duty. Anyone whose first COD is Modern Warfare 2 has a very bad insight into what Call of Duty was actually like in its prime that everyone loved the most, because the focus on staying true to the game's established identity was non-existent. And that's not to say that innovation is at all bad, but we need additive improvements, not subtractive downgrades, which is what Modern Warfare 2 and games before it like Vanguard possessed. So that being said, what is COD at its core? What is its identity? Well, it's a 6v6 first-person shooter with a great balance between its fast-paced and tactical gameplay, fast enough to be fun and stimulating, and still slow enough to allow for tactics and strategy, with small to medium-sized maps and different weapons to choose from, with obviously quality gunplay and movement mechanics to make sure the gameplay is actually able to be enjoyed. After all, it is a first-person shooter, so the gunplay should come first. Modern Warfare 2 strayed from this framework that made the franchise so popular. The gameplay is too tactical and doesn't allow for the fast pace of play because it penalizes so many aspects of the game that make it more speedy. The maps are medium to large in size, and the design philosophy is clearly not the same as maps that players loved in older games. Sure, the weapon variety was there, but the movement and gunplay were certainly not on par with the latest standards that Call of Duty innovated and implemented itself in Modern Warfare 2019, which was a huge positive step forward. They took a step backward by making the movement much clunkier, and the guns really disruptive and jarring to use at times, given they tried to make it much more realistic, which Call of Duty is not very well known for doing, because it's not a tactical shooter at its core. That's not the identity that it established as a franchise. This is the difference between these Western companies and Nintendo. Zelda, for example, is focused on its rich storytelling, exploration, and intricately designed puzzles. Breath of the Wild, although it puts a new spin on Zelda in regards to straying away from the more linear story, is only an upgrade to classic Zelda. And you're perfectly allowed to say that you like old Zelda more. There's certainly a difference, but Zelda did not lose its identity in Breath of the Wild. There's still an amazing Zelda-esque story, well-designed puzzles, and a super enhanced exploration aspect that is just the pinnacle of open-world games, with a super large map and new ways to traverse the environment, like climbing and gliding. It's an absolutely wonderful installment to the series, and you can still tell that it's Zelda, because Nintendo made sure to keep its identity intact. Mario is a fun, accessible platformer with power-ups and other unique elements that change the gameplay and creative new levels that push the boundaries of platformers. Whether a side-scroller or 3D, Mario is still Mario. Mario always feels like Mario. Mario is never suddenly turned into an isometric puzzle game. That would make it Zelda. That would make it lose its identity. All Mario does is get better every single year. And sure, some games are better than others regardless of their chronological order, but certain aspects and elements of the game are always improved, and the positives and negatives are always noticed by the developers. This is partly why Super Mario Odyssey is widely a contender for the best Mario game in the entire 40 years of the series, and also why Super Mario Galaxy, the game Odyssey clearly took tons of inspiration from, is also in competition for that #1 spot. It's no coincidence. Nintendo keeps the identity of all their games, but makes sure that if any innovation is widely loved by audiences, they will be certain to saturate it and improve it in a future title in the most effective way possible. The design philosophy that plagues the West is that popular franchise equals money, and that's that. However, it's quite hilarious to sit back and look at the messes that are unfolding and people catching on to the utter joke that is Western gaming, while Nintendo continues to thrive and release masterpieces. Sure, they're not perfect, they hate the competitive community in every one of their games, and they really hate spin-offs and see it as competition, and they try to steal people's revenue. But man, their games are damn good. Skill-based matchmaking, engagement-optimized matchmaking, microtransactions, releasing incomplete products, and competent heads of development. It's just sometimes funny to watch the West falter when it comes to implementing an actually good design philosophy, which is that quality games get the recognition and sales they deserve. And when you want a game to outsell the previous one, take everything from that game that was good and that the fans loved and additively saturate it to make it even better, and take everything that was negatively received and hated by fans in that game and get rid of it, or attempt to fix it and make it better. To summarize this point into a short, comprehensible soundbite, if a game is good at its bare bones, it will be good no matter what surrounds it. If Modern Warfare 2 had actually fun gunplay and movement, and better maps, and some new, unthought of modern innovations, it would be just like classic COD, but with a modern feel. And whatever BS marketing strategies that they would implement, like the Black Cell Battle Pass and overpriced bundles and the skill-based matchmaking nonsense, would just be the fluff on the outside that wouldn't hurt the game's identity and bare bones quality. Zelda is a great game because it focused on its identity at what the bare bones level made the game great, and stuck with developing and improving that element of the game. There's barely any garbage or unneeded fluff surrounding the bare bones because the game and franchise is so darn solid in the most stripped down state that anything extra is just a welcome surprise and a treat for players. The West focuses on the wrong thing most of the time when it comes to multiplayer games. Sure, we've got a lot of games right, and Nintendo aren't the only ones with the masterpieces. However, Nintendo is certainly the most consistent when it comes to living up to the hype surrounding a game. And that's because with Nintendo, people know exactly what to expect. They don't get any screwing around like dumb money grabs and rigged matchmaking, and they won't get an unfinished buggy mess of a game. And most importantly, they know what the game will be like because of its name. Zelda, although it's constantly improving, is still Zelda. Mario, though constantly improving and being innovative, and maybe changing the flavor of the game, is still Mario. But you can't sit here with Western companies and expect the most huge, hyped new release to be good anymore. You're naive if you do. The proof is in the pudding. You don't even know what to expect when purchasing new installments in famous franchises like Call of Duty and Halo anymore, because the games can't seem to keep their identity due to their focus on the wrong thing: money. I mean, look at the insult that Modern Warfare 2 is. It's clear as day that they didn't invest their time properly into the right areas, and they didn't care enough about the franchise's core feeling and gameplay and identity to stay true to it. And that game was in development for 3 years. You want to know how long Ocarina of Time, arguably the best game ever made, in 1998 took to develop? 6 months shorter than Modern Warfare 2's development period. 2.5 years. And because they focused on establishing the game's identity, it was a humongous success. That game is so damn good that if you're a critic of it, you're just objectively wrong. That's how far I will go. And it's because they hit the nail on the head and intentionally established the game's identity and defined Zelda as Zelda. You can hardly trust any big developers around here nowadays because you genuinely don't know what to expect, whether the title is hyped or not. If it's a super ambitious project, it's likely to drop incomplete and buggy due to horrid deadline rushing, although Elden Ring was a pleasant surprise, being the outlier that actually worked and was complete on release. If a multiplayer game has a recognizable recognizable title like Call of Duty, good luck figuring out whether or not that game will actually feel like any of its predecessors. You just don't know anymore. These companies aren't consistent because their design philosophy is corrupt and greedy. Nintendo obviously needs to make money and wants to make money, but they're genuinely passionate about games, and they make that money with quality, and that quality is promised because the game says Mario or Zelda or Metroid or Kirby or any other recognizable name on the box. My only hope is that someone steps in and says, hey guys, wake up and let's actually deliver a quality title so we can regain the trust of the gaming community again as a whole. Oh wait, here, it can be me. All right, guys, can you wake up and actually restore our trust by giving us innovative, new versions of older beloved franchises that improve upon what gives them their identity, and stop trying to manipulate us with microtransactions and dumb matchmaking and overhyped and overambitious titles that turn out incomplete, and just make a gosh darn good game, please. I'll stand by it. If a game is good at its bare bones, it'll be good regardless of what surrounds it. That's all I have to say at the end of the day. Modern Western gaming consists of famous, beloved game franchises that are losing their identity. But we can learn a lot from how masterfully Nintendo handles their titles. Stay true to the identity of the game, but improve and saturate as many things as humanly possible to make each subsequent title even more wonderful than the one before it. I'm Prime Pete. Thanks for watching. Take it easy.